The Vigil log opens at year 0 by convention, though the station itself is older than the record. Somebody had to start writing it down. The woman who did, the one who first called it a vigil rather than a watch rotation, understood that what we were doing was not merely monitoring but waiting. Her name was Archivist Ren Solvar, and she has been dust for 86,000 years. I have read everything she wrote. The particular way she described the pressure of deep water against hull plate, the faint creak of settlement in the bedrock beneath the station, the cold green light of the relay displays at the bottom of the watch shaft. I know how she thought about the work, and the weight of it, and the long patience it required. In some ways, I think I know how she thought better than she did, because I can see where she was going, and she could not. She kept the record without knowing how it would end. That is a harder thing, I think, than keeping it with the ending in sight. My name is Archivist Diamorn. I am the 431st keeper of the Soreth Shelf Array. I have held Thayston for 11 years, which is a short tenure by the standards of this post. The average is closer to 20, and old Archivist Pellin before me served for 31, until his hands got bad enough that the Continuance Directorate insisted he take a surface posting. He left 6 years before the fleet arrived. I think about that sometimes. 31 years in this station, tending the instruments and keeping the log, learning the particular voice of this place in all its variations, the pressure cycles, the seasonal shifts in the geothermal input, the annual calibration drift in the outermost sensor clusters, and then gone before the ending. I intend to write him a letter when I am done with this entry. He deserves to know what happened from someone who was here. I am writing this so the record is complete. Not because anyone needs me to explain what happened. The array's own sensor logs are comprehensive. The orbital defense networks have their own archives. And the Continuance Directorate will produce a formal after-action document that will run to several thousand pages and be filed in triplicate. I have already been asked to provide a technical account of the activation sequence and operational status of all 6 cache site nodes during the contact event, and I will provide that separately. But the Vigil log is a different thing. It has always been a different thing. It is not a record of instruments. It is a record of what it felt like to keep the watch, in the voice of the person who kept it. Archivist Solvar started that tradition in her very first entry, when she wrote that the instruments were for the Directorate, and the log was for whoever came next, and whatever happened after. I intend to finish it in the same spirit she began it. So, from the beginning, the Soreth Shelf Array sits beneath 500 meters of open ocean, built into the continental shelf, along what the pre-collapse maps called the Eurasian coastal margin. The station proper, the part where keepers like me live and work, occupies a pressurized complex roughly 2 kilometers below the shelf's upper surface, anchored to bedrock and ringed by sensor arrays that extend outward through the rock and sediment in every direction for 300 kilometers. Above us, concealed within the geological strata of the shelf itself, are the weapons platforms. Above those on the ocean floor are the relay towers, tall, narrow structures that look, from any angle a surface vessel might observe them, like natural formations of basalt. They are not natural. They have never been natural. They have been there, in one iteration or another, for 82,000 years. Station was built over the cache sites. That was the whole point. The caches were found by a survey team working the deep shelf in what our calendar calls year 8312 of the Vigil. Approximately 81,700 years ago, survey team was not looking for alien installations. They were mapping shelf geology for a proposed expansion of the coastal megastructure, TRUT, network, the great engineering programs that had been reshaping Earth's continental margins for the preceding 2,000 years, and they found something that did not match the geological record. 6 sites, spaced at intervals that were too regular to be natural, each containing a sealed subsurface installation roughly 40 meters in diameter, buried at between 80 and 120 meters beneath the ocean floor. The installations were inert but powered, drawing heat from geothermal vents through what turned out to be an extraordinarily elegant transfer system, and their outer casings were made of a material that returned no active sensor signature whatsoever. The survey team's equipment had walked right over 4 of them before a passive density anomaly in the bedrock mapping finally registered the presence of something that should not be there. It took 11 years to open the first one without damaging its contents. What they found was not a weapon. It was a seed library, the Veth Ascendancy, as we eventually came to understand them, through decades of analysis of the installation's internal documentation system, operated on a model of resource development that was, in their own framing, elegant and long-sighted. They identified worlds with biological potential. They seeded those worlds with modified genetic material, managed through submerged cache installations that monitored environmental conditions, adjusted the seeding parameters over geological timescales, and eventually, at the end of the development cycle, triggered a harvest protocol. The harvest fleet would arrive, collect the developed biological stock, in Earth's case, certain complex protein structures they had been cultivating in deep ocean ecosystems, and depart. The cycle ran on a 90,000-year clock. The installation's own timer confirmed it. We had 89,000 and change years to go when the survey team opened the first cache. The people who made the decisions about what to do next. I have read their deliberation records, preserved in the Vigil archive. Did not rush. They took 14 years. They convened a continuance council that included oceanographers, materials scientists, xenobiologists, geotechnical engineers, defense architects, legal theorists, and representatives from every coastal megastructure administration on the planet. Composition of the council alone took 3 years to finalize. They were not in this respect hurrying. They understood, Trish, in a way that perhaps only people who had already survived several near-extinction events could understand, that the next thing they did with what they had found mattered more than the speed with which they did it. They mapped all 6 cache sites in the first year. They opened all 6, carefully, over the course of the following decade. They studied everything inside them. They cataloged the biological cultivation programs, the geothermal power systems, the sensor arrays, the timer architecture, the communication protocols. They built models of what the Ascendancy had done to Earth's deep ocean ecosystem, tracing the modifications back as far as the available biological record could reach. They found evidence of the seeding going back further than the installation's own documentation covered, told them that the caches had been in place longer. The Veth's own records showed that the development program predated even the Ascendancy's current institutional memory. That finding changed the tone of the deliberations. I have read the transcripts. The council's mood had been analytical and measured in the early years, became, by the final stages, something harder. Not angry exactly, but harder. More settled, the kind of settled that comes when you have finished being surprised and begun deciding what to do. They decided they would not destroy the caches. They would not remove them. They would build around them, above them, and through them. They would reverse engineer every system the caches contained. They would use what they learned, and they would be ready when the harvest fleet arrived. The Soreth Shelf Array, named for Archivist Solvar, by her own request in her final Vigil log entry, was the result of that decision. It took 900 years to complete the first full construction phase. The scale of it was staggering, even by the standards of what Earth was building in those centuries. The great coastal megastructures, the orbital rings, the atmospheric shield generator chains that now cross the sky from horizon to horizon, above the major continental landmasses. The Soreth Array was not the largest engineering project of that era, but it was, in certain ways, the most precise. Every component of it was positioned in relation to the 6 cache sites. Every targeting array, every sensor cluster, every relay tower was placed where it was because of where the caches were, and what the caches had been, and what we intended to do with the knowledge they had given us. It took another 300 years to integrate all 6 cache sites into the array, targeting, and sensor network. It took another 200 years to confirm. Through 17 successive test activations, every system worked as designed, and then the Vigil began in earnest. A rotation of keepers, never fewer than 3 at any time, living and working in the deep station, maintaining the watch, updating the log, waiting. 431 archivists, 81,000 years. A log that now runs to more than 9 million entries. I had read most of them. I had come to this post already having read the first 5 million. It was, by that point, a standard expectation for anyone applying for the archivist rotation that they would have spent at least 3 years working through the archive before their term of service began. I read the rest during my 11 years here. I was partway through Archivist Pellin's final years, careful, late entries, in which the prose had taken on the slightly looser quality of a person who has been doing something for a very long time, and no longer needs to explain their reasoning to themselves. When the transit wake registered on the deep space sensors, I was in the secondary archive room when the first alert came in. Not the combat station's alert, that came later. The early signal was a soft tone, the kind the station uses for events that require attention rather than immediate action, and it took me a moment to identify which sensor array had triggered it. The deep space passive net. The one we maintain at the edge of the outer system, specifically because the Vigil records indicate that Veth ascendancy vessels use a particular configuration of transit wake that produces a faint but distinctive gravitational signature at distances up to 40 astronomical units. That signature had been analyzed from the cache installation's drive architecture documentation for 60,000 years. We knew what to look for. We were looking for it constantly. 7 signatures, 7 distinct transit wakes, arriving within a window of approximately 9 hours, all on an inbound trajectory consistent with Earth approach. I checked the ascendancy arrival window calculated from the cache installation's own timer. We were inside it. 11 years early by our best estimate of the schedule, well within the margin of uncertainty the Vigil records had always assigned to that calculation. The uncertainty band was 50 years, and we had been operating within it. I sent the notification upward through the relay network, to the Continuance Directorate's Deep Watch desk, to the Planetary Defense Network's Contact Event Protocol Center, and to the array's own command authority, which was a separate channel, because the array technically operated under a different institutional framework than the Planetary Defense Network, a distinction that had been the subject of extensive legal deliberation roughly 30,000 years ago, and had not been fully resolved since. Then I went back to my desk and I sat for a while in the quiet. The deep station is a quiet place. That is one of the things you learn to feel, rather than just know in your first year here. The water above absorbs most surface noise, and the bedrock dampens the rest. And what remains is a quality of silence that has no equivalent on the surface. It is not the absence of sound. The station has its own mechanical heartbeat, the hum of the power grid, and the slow cycling of the pressure equalization systems and the faint whisper of air through the ventilation network. But it is quiet in the way that very old things are quiet, in the way that a cathedral or a mountain or a deep forest is quiet. The silence has weight and presence and history. In that moment, I did not find it oppressive. I found it apt. 81,000 years of preparation, and now 7 ships dropping into the outer system on schedule. The appropriate response was to sit in the quiet and understand what it meant before the noise started. It meant the Vigil was ending. Not done. The Vigil would not be done until the fleet was gone and the log was closed. But the long waiting part, the part that had consumed 430 keepers before me, the part that the station was built for, part that had run so far beyond any individual human lifetime that it existed only as an institution, only as a practice, only as an unbroken chain of people choosing to come to this place and do this work. That part was ending. Whatever came next would be different. I made an entry in the Vigil log. Just a short one. I recorded the sensor data, the time, the number of signatures, the trajectory. Then I added one line that was not technically required by the log format. I have waited 11 years for this. And the people before me waited 81,000 more. I think we are ready. Then I went to the watch shaft and began the activation sequence for the array. The array's activation sequence takes 6 hours for a full cold start. We do not run it cold often. The maintenance rotations include quarterly partial activations to ensure all systems remain functional, and I had run 4 of those myself, the most recent 8 weeks before the fleet arrived. But a full cold start from the deep standby mode is a different order of operation. 6 hours of calibration, systems check, integrations verification across all 6 cache site nodes, getting array alignment, weapons platform power-up and self-test, relay tower confirmation, and final communication handshake with the Planetary Defense Network's Contact Event Protocol Center. During those 6 hours, I was busy in a way I rarely am on ordinary watch rotations, moving through a checklist to 18 pages and requires physical confirmation at 4 separate locations in the station. The confirmation points are deliberately spread across the complex. The engineering team that designed the activation protocol wanted a human being physically walk to each location and verify the reading in person, rather than relying solely on the remote display system. It takes about 40 minutes to do all 4 circuits if you move quickly. And you do 4 circuits across the 6-hour sequence, and by the end of it you have covered considerable ground in a station that is not large by surface standards, but feels substantial when you are walking it alone. I was not entirely alone. The station's protocol requires a minimum of 3 keepers at all times, and my 2 colleagues, Keeper Fen Artis, who had been here 8 years and knew the systems better than I did, and Keeper Celarin, who was in her 2nd year, and still in the phase of the work where everything the job requires is interesting rather than familiar, were both on duty. Ards has handled the weapons platform power-up sequence, which is the most technically demanding part of the activation. Rin managed the relay tower confirmation. Working through the seafloor network from the communications bay, I ran the checklist and coordinated between them. We did not talk much. There was not much to say that the checklist did not already say. But at one point, when all 3 of us were in the main watch shaft for the integration verification, Artis looked at the 6 cache site indicators on the targeting display. 6 small green nodes, each one marking the locations where an Ascendancy installation had stood before we built the array over and through it. And he said, quietly, that he had always thought of the cache sites as the center of what we were doing here. The array was enormous. 300 kilometers of instrumentation in every direction, but it was organized around those 6 points. Everything we had built radiated outward from them. I said that was because it was true. He nodded. Then we went back to the checklist. The Veth fleet was decelerating through the outer system during those 6 hours. By the time the array came to full activation, they had reached the inner system and established a holding orbit at approximately twice the moon's distance. 7 vessels, orbital sensors, had them clearly by then, and the imagery was being distributed across the Planetary Defense Network in real time. I saw it on my secondary display while I worked through the checklist, pausing occasionally to study the shapes. They were not large ships by any standard I would call impressive. The biggest, the command vessel, presumably, was perhaps 400 meters in length, a sleek and functional design with very little external ornamentation, optimized for long transit efficiency rather than combat profile. The 6 smaller vessels were retrieval craft, judging by the external docking and extraction systems visible on their lower hulls. Cranes, collection bays, high-pressure suction arrays designed for deep-water operations. They carried the engineering of their purpose plainly. These were not warships. They were not even exploration vessels. They were collection equipment, the specialized tools of an organization that traveled across vast distances to gather what it had grown elsewhere and bring it home. I thought about the biologists who had spent 3 generations studying the protein structures the caches had been cultivating. I thought about the particular elegance of what the Ascendancy had designed. A passive, automated system that ran for geological timescales without requiring maintenance or intervention, slowly producing exactly what they wanted from Earth's deep ocean chemistry, triggered by environmental conditions the caches themselves monitored and adjusted. It was, in its own terms, extraordinary engineering. Every xenobiologist who had worked on the cache documentation had said so. Extraordinary engineering, thoroughly exploitative premise, completely dismantled and repurposed. Every component of it now integrated into the array, in service of something its designers had not anticipated. We had found their property, and we had taken it apart and built something else from the pieces and the knowledge. That was the truth of it, stated plainly. Not a moral truth and not a legal finding. The directorate would attend to those questions in their own language. But just what happened? A survey team found something in the ocean floor. The Continuance Council decided to use it. 81,000 years of people went down into the dark and kept the watch, and now the fleet had arrived, and the array was active, and here we were. I ran the final integration check at hour 5.5. All 6 nodes confirmed, all systems operational, targeting arrays aligned to the holding orbit. The floor of the ocean was awake. I made an entry in the Vigil log. The first communication came approximately 4 hours after they established holding orbit. We had been told to expect it, and told to let the Planetary Defense Network handle the initial response. The Alaska Communications Authority extends only to exchanges directly related to the cache installations themselves, which, by the time of first contact, had a very specific legal designation in the Directorate's treaty framework. Not treaty in the sense that a treaty had been negotiated, but treaty in the sense that the Directorate had spent 40,000 years developing a legal position on the question of the Ascendancy's claim to those installations, and that position had a name and a filing number, and a set of authorized spokespersons, and I was not among them. So I monitored rather than participated. The signal came in on a frequency that matched the cache installation's own communication architecture. The Ascendancy had designed their caches to serve as relay points for the fleet during the harvest cycle. Which was a piece of integration that had been well documented in the Vigil records for 80,000 years. The Planetary Defense Network intercepted it before it reached the cache nodes, which were no longer capable of relaying anything independently, having been thoroughly integrated into the array's own systems at the hardware level approximately 70,000 years ago. The message was automated in structure. A standard retrieval notification, casting the Ascendancy's harvest cycle identifier, and requesting acknowledgement from the cache network. When no acknowledgement came, there was a pause of approximately 2 hours, and then a second transmission, this one not automated. A voice transmission, speaking in the Veth communication language that our linguists had been decoding from the cache documentation for 80,000 years, and which we had spoken fluently for at least 60,000. With a literature of translation work running to hundreds of thousands of documents, the translator rendered it cleanly. The Planetary Defense Network's response team had a speaker ready, the Veth commander. I never learned their name through the official channels, and the Vigil record refers to them only as the Recovery Director, which is the title their vessel's documentation used for the position, began by identifying the fleet and its purpose. The Veth Ascendancy Recovery Division, 7th cycle, arrived on schedule to collect developed biological material from 6 designated cache installations in the coastal shelf region. Coordinates provided, requesting clearance for descent to collection altitude. The Planetary Defense Network's response was brief and precisely worded, and I had helped draft it. Or rather, current draft had been assembled from contributions by more than 24 archivists across the preceding 4,000 years, dated and refined, as our understanding of Veth communication protocols and legal frameworks deepened with each new generation of cache documentation analysis. It informed the Recovery Director that the cache installations in the specified coordinates were no longer operational as independent systems, that the biological material from those installations had been integrated into Earth's own development programs more than 80,000 years ago, that the retrieval schedule was therefore no longer applicable to any currently existing asset, and that the fleet was requested to maintain holding orbit, while a formal statement of accounting was prepared and transmitted. There was a much longer pause this time. Then the Recovery Director came back on the channel, and the translator rendered the tone of their response as something between confusion and what I could only describe as professional indignation. They were not hostile in any military sense. They were operating from a framework in which the situation I had just described was not supposed to be possible. Their caches were engineered to be inert, undetectable, and tamper-resistant. The casings were designed to return no active sensor signature. The geothermal power draw was calibrated to be indistinguishable from natural vent activity. The biological modifications to the ocean ecosystem were subtle enough to be invisible to any species that had not specifically been told to look for. The development cycles ran for 90,000 years, specifically because biological life on target worlds did not, in their experience, develop sufficient technological capability in that time frame to locate, access, and repurpose a sealed ascendancy installation. It was supposed to be a quiet agricultural site. The idea that something had gone wrong with that model was not a contingency they had planned for, because in their operational history, it had never been necessary to plan for it. I kept my eye on the deep space sensor array while the exchange continued above me. The 7 ships held their orbit. No descent, no lateral movement. No communication on any frequency other than the one the Planetary Defense Network was monitoring. They were, whatever else was true of them, listening carefully. The formal statement of accounting took 3 hours to transmit in full. It was comprehensive in the way that 81,000 years of preparation makes things comprehensive. There was an answer for every question the ascendancy might ask, and evidence for every answer, and documentation for every piece of evidence. The geology survey of all 6 cache sites as they currently existed, with imagery of the array installations that now occupied those coordinates, a timeline of the discovery, the analysis period, the continuance council deliberations, and the construction phases of the Sorath array, technical summary of the biological material that had been found in the caches and what had been done with it. The answer to which was, in abbreviated form, that Earth's xenobiologists had spent 3 generations characterizing the ascendancy's cultivation modifications, that the protein structures in question had been isolated and analyzed across a further 15,000 years of research, that the applications of that research had branched into 11 distinct fields of Earth's own biotechnology programs, that there was no stockpile of the original material available for collection because it had been used. Not destroyed. Used. There was a distinction, and the statement made it clearly. The statement of accounting also included, as its final section, clear and detailed technical description of the Sorath Shelf Array's current operational status. Fully active, fully calibrated, all 6 cache site nodes integrated and functioning, covering all former cache coordinates and approximately 300 kilometers of surrounding ocean floor, with targeting authority extending to the holding orbit where the fleet currently sat. We did not threaten. That had been a principle of the Directorate's position for 40,000 years of refinement, and I had argued for it in my own small way. During the theoretical review sessions the Directorate runs every decade. The statement of accounting was not a threat. It was an accounting. Here is what happened. Here is what exists now. Here is what you are looking at from where you are sitting. The drawing of conclusions was left to the Recovery Director. Recovery Director drew them. Another long pause, the longest yet. I watched the holding orbit on the sensor display. 7 ships. None of them moved. When the Recovery Director came back on the channel, translator rendered the opening of their transmission as something the linguist on duty took a moment to characterize carefully. She finally settled on a phrase that translated approximately as formal objection under 7th cycle operational protocol. It was the language of a professional working within an institutional framework, filing the correct paperwork for a situation their framework had a category for. The Recovery Director stated that the cache installations were ascendancy property, that the biological material within them was ascendancy property, that the ecological modifications constituted an ascendancy development investment representing 90,000 years of compound cultivation value, and that the failure to preserve that investment for collection constituted a material breach of the Standard Resource Development Compact. They requested that Earth's governing authority acknowledge the compact and make arrangements for appropriate compensation or equivalent biological transfer. The linguist rendered the last phrase twice because the first rendering seemed too flat, and she wanted to make sure the nuance came clearly in the transcript. It did come through clearly. The Recovery Director was asking to be paid. I sat very still in the watch shaft for a moment. Then I made an entry in the Vigil log. Just a brief one. I wrote, "They are asking for payment. They have come 90,000 light years and 89,000 years of elapsed time to collect a harvest that has been feeding our biotechnology programs for 80,000 years. And their response to learning this is to ask whether we intend to compensate them for it. Then I wrote one more line. Archivist Solvar would have found this remarkable too. Shh. The Planetary Defense Network referred the compensation request to the Continuance Directorate. Had been expecting it. Not this specific form of it, but the general category. The Directorate's response was prepared. It had been prepared, in its earliest form, approximately 40,000 years ago, and updated in every subsequent decade, fined as our linguistic models improved, and our understanding of ascendancy legal frameworks deepened from the cache documentation. The compensation request triggered the document's second section provisions, and those provisions were clear. The response was long. See, I will summarize it, because the full version is in the archive, and the summary is what matters for the record of what happened next. The Directorate's position rested on 4 arguments, each of which had been developed and refined independently by successive generations of legal theorists, and each of which stood on its own even if the others were rejected. The first, resource development compact the recovery director cited, was not a compact to which Earth had ever been a party. It had been imposed unilaterally, without negotiation, without notification, and without the knowledge of the world it affected. A compact requires consenting parties. Earth had never been consulted, never informed, never given the opportunity to agree or object. What the Ascendancy had created was not a compact. It was a plan, implemented on a world that did not know it was being planned around. The second, the 81,000 years of elapsed time since the discovery of the installations, during which the Veth Ascendancy had made no contact, no inspection, no maintenance visit, and no communication of any kind, constituted, under any reasonable interpretation of property law in any legal framework the Directorate had studied, abandonment. Property that is left on a world you neither visit nor monitor for 81,000 years has been abandoned. Earth had found it, studied it, and used it. That is what happens to abandoned property. The third, the biological ecosystem modifications introduced by the Ascendancy's cultivation had been imposed on Earth's environment without consent across a time frame that predated the installation's own documentation. The 81,000 years of work required to identify, characterize, and understand those modifications, the xenobiological research programs, the ecological remediation efforts, the reverse engineering that had produced the array, constituted a counterclaim for damages and remediation, costs that substantially exceeded any reasonable valuation of the protein harvest the Ascendancy had expected to collect. The fourth, the array itself, not stated as a threat, not stated as leverage, not stated as a negotiating position, stated simply as a material fact in the accounting of the situation. The Ascendancy's property, where it had existed, had been integrated into Earth's infrastructure. The infrastructure was now active and operational, and covering the coordinates where the property had stood. This was a description of what the fleet was looking at from their holding orbit. Nothing more and nothing less. The Directorate concluded by offering 2 of the 7 vessels free departure at any time of their choosing. Those 2 vessels would be provided, before departure, with a full copy of the Vigil archive, all 9 million entries, from Archivist Solvar's first record of the survey team's discovery to the current operational status of the array, translated into the Veth communication language by the same linguistic programs we had spent 80,000 years developing. The record would travel with them. Whatever else the Ascendancy took from this encounter, they would take that. The remaining 5 vessels would remain at holding orbit pending further discussion. The recovery director asked, after a pause, how long the further discussion might take. The Directorate's response was 4 words in the Veth language. The translator rendered them, as long as necessary. I was not in the watch shaft when the recovery director made their final transmission of that first day. I was in the secondary archive room, where I had retreated after 4 straight hours at the instruments to eat something and allow myself an hour of relative stillness. I heard the transmission through the room's speaker system, sitting with my meal cooling on the table in front of me, listening to the voice of someone a very long way from home. The recovery director began formally, the standard Veth notation for a transmission, intended for the permanent record. And then, about a third of the way through, shifted into something the translator flagged with a hesitation note, indicating that the register had changed in a way that required interpretive judgment. The translator's best rendering identified it as a direct personal address. Not to the Planetary Defense Network, not to the Directorate and its legal arguments, to the installations on the ocean floor, to whoever was maintaining them. I have kept this moment verbatim in the Vigil log, in the original Veth language, and in full translation, because it belongs there and it does not belong summarized. What the recovery director said, in the translator's most careful rendering, was this: "We built those sites 89,000 years before your reckoning began. We placed them carefully. We designed them to last and to work without attention, because attention is expensive across the distances we travel and the timescales we operate. We did not come to harm your world. We came to collect what our predecessors planted, the same way a farmer returns to harvest what was sown in another season. I understand that you will not accept that framing, and I understand why you will not accept it, and I will not argue it further. What I want to say is this: we expected to find an ocean and 6 quiet installations and a harvest ready for collection. Instead we found this. Whatever your log says about what it is meant to keep this watch, I do not have access to it, but I know what I am looking at. The thing on your ocean floor is not an agricultural site. It has not been an agricultural site for a very long time. What it is now, and what it took to make it what it is, I cannot fully calculate from where I sit. But we have seen it. Whatever else is recorded from this encounter, let it be recorded that we came, and we saw what you built, and we understood that we had miscalculated the kind of world this was. We will carry that understanding with us." Then the formal closing notation, then silence. I sat in the secondary archive room for a long time after the transmission ended. The meal was cold. I did not eat it. I made an entry in the Vigil log. It was the longest entry I had written in 11 years. And I will not reproduce it here in full, because some of what I wrote in it was, in truth, private thing. The kind of reflection that has appeared in this log before, across the centuries, when the weight of what the Vigil meant came down on a keeper with particular force, and they needed to put it somewhere. But I will say this much. I wrote that the recovery director had seen us, not Earth, not the array, not the Directorate and its legal arguments, the Vigil, the 431 keepers. The 9 million entries, the 81,000 years of choosing to come to this quiet, dark place and write down what happened and what it felt like. And someone from the civilization that had started all of this, without ever meaning to, by burying 6 seed caches in our ocean floor 90,000 years ago, had looked at what we built in response and understood, at least in part, what it had taken. I thought Archivist Solvar would have wanted to know that. I thought all of them would have wanted to know that. The negotiation sessions ran for 11 days. I was peripheral to most of what happened in those 11 days. The Directorate and the Defense Network handled the substance, and my role was to maintain the array and keep the Vigil log current and be available for technical questions. Technical questions did arise, from both sides of the exchange. The Directorate asked me to confirm several specifics of the cache site integration that were relevant to the dispute arguments. The fleet's own technical staff, they had one, single specialist aboard the command vessel, transmitted questions through the official channel about how certain components of the array had been derived from the cache architecture. I answered those questions as precisely as I could. The fleet's technical staff was genuinely interested in what we had done. I could tell from the specificity and the sequence of their questions followed the logic of an engineer working through a reverse engineering problem, from the results backward to the method. We had taken their cache system, which was, in its own terms, sophisticated and elegant, and integrated it into something roughly 3 orders of magnitude larger. The array used the cache sites as anchor points in the sensor network, the way a surveyor uses fixed benchmarks to extend a larger grid. It used the geothermal transfer systems the caches had employed for power as additional heat exchange nodes in the array's own power grid, contributing a small but consistent fraction of total station energy. It used the biological monitoring algorithms from the cache software as templates for the array's ocean environment modeling system scaled enormously and repurposed from agricultural monitoring to tactical environmental awareness. We had not discarded anything we found in those caches. We had used everything, transformed everything, built everything into something new. The technical staff's questions grew more focused as the 11 days progressed. By the end of it, I had the impression that they understood, at least at the level of general architecture, what we had built and how. I do not know what they made of it. I do not know whether understanding it made the situation easier or harder for them to process. But I thought, not for the first time, about what it must feel like to arrive with the expectation of a quiet agricultural pickup, and find that the world you planted things in had taken your seeds and grown something that could hold your fleet in place, while lawyers argued at you in your own language. Between my own technical consultations and the Vigil log maintenance, there was little time for anything resembling rest across those 11 days. I slept when I could, 4 or 5 hours at a stretch, and I ate at irregular intervals, and I walked the station's corridors in the early hours of the station's night cycle, when the communication traffic slowed and the watch shaft could manage on monitoring protocols for an hour. The station has 3 corridors of any real length. After 11 years, I know every cease in the bulkhead plating, every variation in the ambient hum of the power grid from one section to the next. I have walked those corridors in the dark, in the deep quiet of the ocean above, more times than I can count. There is something about walking in that particular dark that the Vigil log records show has been noted by archivists going back several thousand years, a quality of solitude that is not loneliness, a weight that is not burden, sense being where you were supposed to be, that has nothing to do with comfort and everything to do with purpose. I made entries in the Vigil log every day of the 11 days, short ones mostly, observations, technical notes, the occasional reflection. On the 7th day, I wrote a longer entry about the nature of the Veth's position, as I understood it from the transmissions I had monitored. They were not villains, as far as I could determine. They were, in a certain light, exactly what they appeared to be. Professionals of an organization that operated across geological timescales, following protocols that had presumably worked for a very long time on a very large number of worlds. The model was wrong. The model had collided, in this instance, with a world that had found the model, studied the model, and built a response to the model across 81,000 years of disciplined institutional effort. That was not the model's usual outcome. I wrote, in that entry, that I felt something close to sympathy for the recovery director, not for the Ascendancy's program, which was exploitative and wrong regardless of how long-standing or institutionally sanctioned it was, for the individual person trying to manage the professional and personal reality of having traveled 90,000 light years to discover that everything they expected was gone and everything they did not expect had been growing in its place. That is a hard thing to absorb. I gave them for absorbing it with as much steadiness as the transmissions suggested they had. The agreement that emerged from the 11 days was close to the median scenario the Directorate's planners had anticipated. The Veth Ascendancy Recovery Division, 7th cycle, would formally acknowledge in the permanent record that the cache installations in the specified coordinates were no longer extant as Ascendancy property. The Ascendancy would receive a complete copy of the Vigil archive. Before departure, 2 designated vessels would depart freely. The remaining 5 vessels would depart as a group at an agreed time, safe the conduct guarantees from the Planetary Defense Network. After the formal acknowledgement was transmitted and received and logged, the recovery director accepted the terms. I could hear the weight of it in the final transmission, not defeat in any military sense, because there had been no military encounter, something subtler than defeat. The translator, stretched to the limits of what translation can do with emotional register, finally settled on a word it rendered as the revision of a working model. They had built the model carefully. They had trusted it because it had worked before on other worlds, across other cycles, and they had arrived at the end of this cycle to find that the model required revision, that what they had assumed about the kind of world this was, and the kind of thing 90,000 years would produce here, was wrong, not catastrophically wrong, revisingly wrong. I understood that, in my own way. Every archivist who ever read the previous entries in this log and then sat down to add their own had been doing something similar, revising the model of what the Vigil was, what it meant, what it was building toward, based on what the entries before them had revealed. 431 revisions, 9 million entries, one long slow understanding, accumulated over a timescale that no individual mind could encompass. The two advanced vessels departed on the morning of the 12th day. I watched them go on the deep space sensor display from the watch shaft. They moved with the efficiency I had come to associate with Veth operational style. No hesitation, no ceremony visible to any instrument we had. A smooth transition from holding orbit to transit vector that the array tracked until they were well past the inner system boundary. They carried the Vigil archive with them. The full 9 million entries, packaged and translated, transmitted to their data systems in the hours before departure. Archivist Solvar's careful first record. The survey team's anomaly report, 14 years of council deliberations. Her final log entry, requesting that the station bear her name. 430 keepers, and then me, and all of it going now into the long dark between stars with two ships that had come to collect a harvest and were leaving instead with a history they had not expected to find. I hoped their linguists were good. I hoped someone at the other end of that transit, whoever received the archive, would read it with the seriousness it deserved. Not as evidence in a property dispute, not as a technical record of what we had built, as what it actually was. The account of a people who found something buried in their ocean floor and decided collectively, and over a very long time, to remember it, and kept that decision alive across 81,000 years, generation after generation, until the moment the remembering became necessary. The 5 remaining vessels departed on the morning of the 14th day. The formal acknowledgement had been transmitted the previous evening, and the Planetary Defense Network had confirmed receipt and logged it into the permanent treaty record. The 5 vessels moved out of holding orbit in close formation, maintaining the same precision and efficiency as the advanced pair, climbing through the inner system on their transit vector without deviation. I tracked them on the sensor display until they were beyond the moon's orbit, then beyond the outer planets, then at the edge of the passive net's reliable range, where the signatures began to blur and soften, then gone. I held the display on the edge of the passive net's range for a while after the signatures faded. The display showed what it always shows when nothing is there. The slow, faint background scatter of the outer system, the thermal signature of the distant sun against the cold, the periodic blip of the monitoring buoys we maintain at the system's edge. It was the same display I had watched on ordinary watch rotations for 11 years. It was different now, in the way that the same view from a window is different. The morning after something important has ended. The light is the same. The distance is the same. What has changed is what you know you are no longer waiting for. The watch shaft was quiet. It is always quiet here. I ran through the shutdown sequence for the array's combat active mode, a partial step down, not a full standby, because the Directorate's protocol required 30 days of warm status following any contact event. The targeting arrays stepped down from active lock to monitoring sweep. The weapons platforms held their standby posture. The relay towers on the ocean floor continued their passive environmental scan. The same scan they had been running for 82,000 years, watching the water above them for anything that did not belong there. I went to the secondary archive room and I ate something. The meal was warm this time. Artis and Rin were in the common area when I came through. Artis was writing something, his own account, I suspected. Keepers are not required to maintain personal logs. Rin was looking at the ceiling, which is what she does when she is thinking something through. Neither of them said anything for a while. Then Rin said she had been thinking about the recovery director's final transmission, the personal address part, the part where they said, "We have seen it." She asked what I thought that meant for them, what it changed, if it changed anything. I said I did not know. I said that what it changed for us was enough to think about for now. She nodded. Artis kept writing. I went back to the watch shaft and made the final entry of the day in the Vigil log. There is a question that several of the archivists before me wrestled with, and I wrestled with it too, across my 11 years here. And I am going to put my answer in this log because it belongs here, and because whoever comes next, whatever form the keeper rotation takes now, that the Vigil's original purpose has been fulfilled, deserves to know what I concluded. The question is, what were we protecting? The obvious answer is Earth. The defense of a world that remembered being used and decided not to be used again, that built something enormous and patient and precise over the site of its exploitation, and waited for the day that exploitation would be attempted. Again, that answer is not wrong. It is, in the most immediate terms, correct. But I have read 9 million Vigil log entries, or as close to 9 million as 11 years of reading aloud. I have read what 430 people thought about while they sat in this station, tending instruments, and writing down what they noticed and felt and understood. Some of them were afraid. Some of them were bored, genuinely and deeply bored, in the way that only people doing important repetitive work for years can be bored. Some of them were moved by the work in ways they found difficult to articulate. All of them kept going, and what strikes me, reading all of that accumulated voice, is that the archivists were not primarily thinking about defense. They were thinking about memory. Archivist Solvar wrote, in one of her earliest entries, entry number 12, I believe, written in the 3rd month of her tenure, that the Vigil was not about the aliens. It was about the record. It was about the fact that something had happened to Earth, something had been done to Earth without Earth's knowledge or consent by a civilization that expected to return and find nothing capable of remembering, and the Vigil was the act of refusing that expectation. The array was the instrument of defense. The log was the instrument of memory. Both were necessary. Neither was sufficient without the other. A defense without memory is a reflex. A memory without defense is a lament. The Vigil was both, and that was why it worked. I think she was right. I have thought about little else in the days since the fleet departed. What we protected was not just Earth. We protected the record of what had happened to Earth. We protected the knowledge of what had been done here, buried in our ocean floor, across the geological depths of time, before our species had the capacity to understand what it meant. We protected the institutional act of choosing to remember, and choosing to keep remembering, generation after generation, past the pod point where any individual person could see the purpose in it. Protected the idea that some things are worth keeping faith with across timescales that dwarf any human life. The timescales that matter to the universe do not align themselves with human lifetimes. The Veth Ascendancy built their caches on a world they assumed had no memory capable of outlasting 90,000 years. They were wrong about that. We are a species that builds institutions when we want to remember something. Councils, archives, keeper rotations, log files that grow one entry at a time across 80 millennia. We built one of those institutions over the thing they buried, and we kept it going, and the keeping was as important as the building. Not because it was easy. It was not easy. 11 years in this station was not easy, and 31 years was not easy, and the keepers who spent their entire working life here and retired before the fleet arrived. They had the hardest part, I think, because they spent everything they had on something they never saw completed. And then the fleet arrived, and the array activated, and the record traveled, and the Vigil ended. Archivist Solvar is dust. Everything she thought and did and wrote is in the archive. And the archive is now on a ship, moving through the outer dark, carrying the full account of what we were, and what we did, and why. I do not know how the Ascendancy will read it. Do not know what 81,000 years of human voice sounds like to a civilization that planted seeds on our ocean floor and came back 90,000 years later, expecting silence. I hope they read it carefully. I hope they find in it something that changes how they think about the worlds they visit. The recovery director said, "We will carry the record." I believe them. Not because I trust them, particularly. Trust is not a thing you extend on the basis of a single contact event, and the Directorate will spend considerable resources monitoring the Ascendancy's movements for the foreseeable future. But I believe the statement itself was sincere. They saw something they did not expect to see, and the seeing changed something, and they said so in a transmission they knew would be logged and archived and added to the record we were already keeping. That is not nothing. The Vigil log now closes in its original form with this entry. The watch continues. It will always continue in some form. The array requires maintenance, and the ocean requires watching, and the work that has been done here over 81,000 years does not simply end because the event it was built to address has occurred. The form of the work will change. The directorate will make those decisions. I will continue to keep the station and the log until I am told otherwise. Then, I will write one final entry and hand the watch to whoever comes next. Before that happens, I want to say this. They came back 90,000 years, after they planted something in our ocean floor, expecting silence and compliance, and a harvest ready for collection. What they found instead was the work of 81,000 years of human memory. A station in the deep and a log and an array, built from their own engineering, turned against the purpose it was made for, and 431 voices saying across geological time, "We are here, we remember, we are ready. We were ready. We have always been ready, not from luck, not from accident, not from any single act of heroism or genius, from patience. The long institutional discipline of keeping the watch, generation after generation, in the quiet dark beneath the water, because the people who began it understood something that the ascendancy had apparently not encountered before, that the depth of a civilization is not measured in what it can build in a season. It is measured in what it can remember across an age. I am closing the day's log now. Archivist Diamorn Soreth Shelf Array, Watch Station 1 year 81,412 of the Vigil, Day 14 of the contact event,